Welcome to Johnson City, Texas, boyhood home of Lyndon Baines Johnson, 36th President of the United States.
And literally behind us is the boyhood home where he lived when he was young. He kind of lived all over the place, we've discovered, but this is one part of the Lyndon Johnson National Park. This is just one small part of it, actually. And then down the road about maybe 15 miles or so is the LBJ Ranch, which I think most people equate with Lyndon Johnson and the Texas White House.
And the Texas White House. And they're all part of the national park. It's just two different places because Johnson was born at the ranch, moved back here when he was 5, and lived here for most of his young adult into graduation, early 20s. And then moved on to D.C. when he was, working in politics, and eventually in 1951 bought out his relatives' property and interest back in the farm and moved out there to really form what we now know as the ranch. Here in Johnson City, it's his boyhood home, his grandparents' settlement, his aunts and uncles. They all founded Johnson City. So Johnson City is named for the Johnson family sort of as a whole, but it was his ancestors that came here from Georgia to kind of help settle this area.
Because that's a question that gets asked a lot. Was Johnson City named for Lyndon Johnson? Which came first, right? And Johnson City was here because of his ancestors. And there's actually a couple different parts to this part of the park. You can take a walking loop and a trail and go see that original settlement. Some of the buildings from the 1860s and 70s are still there. And there's a display at the event center, I think they call it, but it's all about cowboys and sort of the history of what was going on with cattle droving at the time and that kind of thing. And then you have a visitor center that has quite a bit of information in it. And then you have the actual boyhood home that you can take a tour of the outside, but to get inside, you have to go with a park ranger. They do guided tours. It was maybe 20 minutes of a tour.
I think ours was a bit longer, but we ask a lot of questions. Big surprise, because there's a lot of history that I want to know. But they're on the hour. It is free, but you have to, wait for the on the hour tour with the ranger. And yeah, they said it's usually about a 20-minute tour. You get to see, the bedrooms, the kitchens, kind of the desk where his father worked when his father was a state legislator here in Texas, and just kind of hear some of the fun stories of growing up here in Johnson City.
So the house, which was Johnson's boyhood home, they said they've restored it to be about the 1920s, 1920. And so when you see the technology or the kitchen appliances and that kind of thing, that's the area you're going to see. The ranger was telling us over the years, this has been used for a lot of different things. It was apartments at one time. It was a community center. You mentioned that Lyndon bought the ranch from his aunt who was living there at the time and was getting older, couldn't take care of it. So he actually bought the ranch from her and the house that was there. And then she moved out back to this house and he gave her a stipend to survive, that kind of thing. And so it's just a very interesting history of what this house has been through. And we've seen this in other places where historic houses get changed and modified and used for other things. And then the National Park Service gets it, or a state park system gets it, and they have to restore it backwards to make it look like it used to. And this one was taken back to 1920.
What was interesting, though, is he said they did not build this house. LBJ's father and his mother bought this house from somebody else that lived in it first. But then after that, it always stayed in the Johnson family. So despite all of those different uses that it had, it always remained in control by the Johnson family. So that is kind of unique, actually, that we didn't lose that history, that somebody didn't buy it and tear it down and put a parking lot up, because that's what tends to happen with history a lot of times. But you can still drive through Johnson City and still see some of the buildings that were original. There's a picture here about what Johnson City looked like in like the 1870s, 60s. And they kind of joked that they said it was a small town with, you could not buy a pound of meat or a loaf of bread because they were assuming that you were making those in your own house, but they did have a little cafe and, a couple, like a general store and some things. But that's pretty much all there was in the 1860s when the family first kind of settled in this area. But yeah, it's just kind of cool to walk around and realize, what the history is here, and that the 36th president of the United States lived in this little house right behind us.
It is interesting to see all of this, and I just think it's great that both this property and the ranch and everything stayed in the Johnson family. So like you said, it was able to be preserved, and then Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson deeded all of the property. So this house and the land that it's on and the ranch and the Texas White House and everything was staying in the family until it was handed over to the National Park Service. So we were talking today, it's one of the few places where you have a former president's boyhood home and their ranch and everything that you can still get out and see. And it's just really neat to experience it. As part of our continuing LBJ tour here in Texas, we just finished going through the LBJ Presidential Library and Museum in Austin.
This was really interesting and definitely another worthwhile stop on the sort of LBJ tour. You know, between the Boyhood home, the ranch, and then the library and museum, you really truly get a full picture of LBJ and Lady Bird's life and the influences from their lives and how they influence the American public and the world.
And I thought you really got a good sense here in particular as they presented their lives and their own personal histories, sort of the characters that they both were. They both seem to be that. And I like one of the things that I think they sell it in the gift shop. One of the statements here is it's not politics, it's history. And I think in particular that was Lyndon Johnson's and Lady Bird Johnson's goal with this was to let people understand what the times were like, what they went through in the White House and getting to the White House and a little bit afterwards. So it was just, I thought it was presented really well.
One of my favorite exhibits here was actually on Lady Bird, and they did a really good job of explaining her history, upbringing, and everything as well, because she was a pioneer in her own way. I mean, she went to college, she earned multiple degrees, and throughout her time, she really not only influenced the American public as First Lady, but then she bought a radio station and turned it into a TV station. She founded the Wildflower Center. She was big on beautification, natural resources. So we do owe a lot of even, the beautification acts that Lyndon signed in to law were really as a result of Lady Bird's influence, and because she had been brought up with a lot of outdoors activities, and her aunt took her on all these trips to Colorado and various places around the United States and really immersed her in nature, and so that influenced her growing up and then influenced her husband as well. So I think it was just fascinating, all the things that we have to credit her with just as much as we have to credit LBJ.
Oh, absolutely. The cost was $13 a person for adults to get in, but you're going to want to spend several hours here easily. I mean, there's plenty to see and to read. There's a lot of historical things, not just about the Johnsons, but also about, as I said, what was going on at the time around the nation and around the world. So there's a lot of displays to read. There's a lot of, artifacts is the word that you would use, throughout history of things that were in their lives and in the White House and just I don't know. I thought it was just, this kind of stuff is really interesting to us because we're history geeks, but I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun to see the dresses that she wore or the pens that he used to sign bills, the desk that he used, in the Oval Office. And they do have a little 1/8 scale reproduction of his Oval Office, during the time here. So there are fun things to see. And then because this is not just the museum, but it is the Presidential Library, you walk up the grand staircase and it is a glass wall of 4 floors of all of the actual archives. Now, if you want to go see those, it's a separate floor. Then you have to go in and get permission to go into the archives themselves. But the library and the building was designed so that you walk up that staircase and you see the millions of volumes of documents that are here, and preserved. So it's a very impressive facility.
Well, and if I remember correctly, that was actually Lady Bird's idea to put those 4 stories of windows in on the inside. So as you went up that grand staircase, you could get a glimpse of, all of the archives that were there in this building. And I also learned, I didn't realize that it was, I think it was 1972, there was a civil rights symposium held here at the library, and it was Lyndon Johnson's last public speech that he gave before he died from his second heart attack at just the young age of 64. So it was pretty neat to see that and to think about things that happened in this building and again, just sort of experience that history.
One of the things you will get here, more than you will get at either the ranch or the Boyhood home, is definitely the politics and everything. His run for Congress, Senate, all of his races, as well as the political upheavings of the time. So whether it was Vietnam or the Civil Rights Movement, the missile crisis, this NASA race. I mean, that was one of the things that we learned, and I guess I never really realized it. You've got the Johnson Space Center. We know it was named after Johnson, but it was actually because when he was a U.S. representative, or senator?
He was a senator.
Senator. He introduced the bill to found NASA, and then as vice president was appointed to sort of lead the special commission for the space program. And then 6 months after he left the presidency, we landed on the moon. So it really is a testament to him. He was a big proponent of the space program and NASA, which we are very thankful for. So it was just kind of cool to see all of that history come together. But like you said, here you get a lot more of those specific details. Whereas like if you visit the ranch or the Boyhood home, it's more about just his life in those particular periods of time. Whereas this is more of the political side of his life.
So there's a lot to see and do and enjoy in Austin, but I would put this on your list if you have any interest in history of that time or that time period and anything it has to do with Lyndon Johnson and Lady Bird Johnson. There's plenty to check out in this building.
Welcome to the LBJ Ranch, or now better known as the Lyndon B. Johnson National Historic Ranch District, which is the second part of the LBJ National Park. Part 1 is the Johnson Boyhood home, and part 2 is sort of the adult home of Lyndon B. Johnson.
Yeah, and we're actually standing at what was the original entrance to the LBJ Ranch. And in fact, this little white hut behind us here was where the Secret Service used to be stationed when they would watch the front gate. And, and then LBJ and guests and others would drive in through here when he wasn't flying in, I suppose. but when he was driving around through the area, they would use this road that's now closed and would, go across the Pedernales River into the LBJ Ranch. And
well, we should actually, let's talk about that for a second. The ranch is on the other side of the river. So the only two ways to get to the ranch at that time were to cross the river, and we can show you some pictures of what crossing the river looked like. I mean, they literally built a little roadway through the river and drove across it with water still flowing, or flying in, and LBJ had a runway installed directly through his ranch so that he could land himself and his dignitaries and all the Secret Service right directly in front of the Texas White House.
Yeah, and that is a big part of this. I mean, obviously the LBJ Ranch is famous in this area for the size of it and just everything that happened here with him and the ranching, but the Texas White House, as it's known, is where they would set up shop, and he did a lot of the nation's business and the world's business here in little Stonewall, Texas, at this ranch. And it's interesting when you go in, and we'll talk about the tour here in a little bit, but you look at all the different cabinet meetings they had in the Texas White House and all these people that flew in from DC and elsewhere. And I have to wonder how many were like, we're going where? Stonewall, Texas? What is this place?
Yeah, I mean, it still is today a little bedroom community out in the country. I mean, you've got Fredericksburg on one side, Johnson City on the other. Neither of those are very big, so and definitely at the time it was a relatively, out in the middle of nowhere kind of place.
Although Fredericksburg and Johnson City are cities compared to Stonewall. There's not much here.
I guess so, but they even say Johnson City is sort of misnamed because there's really no city to it. But Fredericksburg has about 10,000 people. I mean, it's decently sized, I guess. But at any rate, I mean, this was pretty much all that was here at the time. And so, yeah, for people coming in from around the world, cabinet members and foreign dignitaries and all of those people, this had to be quite a treat. And LBJ really showed off when he was here too. He'd put on these big elaborate barbecues and drive people around his, hundreds of acres of ranch that he had to show off his herd. And it had to be a very different experience, especially from the folks at Washington we're used to.
Well, and there are some stories from Secret Service agents about having to kind of keep up because LBJ would, jump in the convertible with some people and take off down the ranch roads and do different things. They'd have to try to keep up with him as he was kind of showing off where he was from, and he was proud of it, and that's great. And this is still a really, he gave him the full Texas experience, I think, when they were here. So that was really cool. And today you can now drive through the ranch yourself. It is interesting because it's a joint venture between the National Park Service that has the LBJ Ranch and then the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, which has the state park, the LBJ State Park and Historic Site, right across Ranch Road 1 from the National Park and from the ranch. It is a joint operation, and it used to be, I think, when Lady Bird was still living at the ranch, you had to board a bus at the state park, and they would drive you into the ranch. And that is still set up so that you have to go to the State Park Visitor Center, you have to get your free permit, and then you can drive in and take a tour of the ranch yourself.
Unfortunately, today, you do not get to drive through and across the river. So even though this gate is still here, this is now closed and is no longer the official entrance. You have to drive down a mile over the road, cross a real bridge, and then head back into the ranch itself. So, but you can sort of walk down to where that entrance would have been and see the pictures of LBJ and Lady Bird driving the car across. But unfortunately, we can no longer drive through the river today. We have to go around it. But I think how fun that would have been at the time. But I'm sure the Secret Service loved it.
I would also mention, as you stop at the state park to get your visitor's permit, make sure you check out the state park. We've been park hosts there for a few months. We've really enjoyed it, and there's a lot to do there. We're going to have a whole video just on the state park, and there's a living history farm that you've been volunteering at. So plenty of things to do on that side of the road as well. And then you can come over here and enjoy what they call a driving tour. And I would say, yes, you do have to drive it. You're not going to really walk it or anything like that. But there's so much more to experience here if you do park and get out of your car and check out some of the things and the sights that you can still see here.
I think it's considered a driving tour simply because it is like miles around the ranch. And so there are places where you get out and stop and take pictures and look at interpretive signs and see the outsides and some insides of some of the buildings. But you really are driving because they take you in and they take you like miles and miles around and through the ranch and then back out. Make sure when you stop and get your free permit that you also pick up a map of the driving tour so that you know where and what you're stopping at. So there are interpretive signs along the way, but at least the map will sort of guide you. Because one thing that's a little backwards right now is you don't get to the main visitor center at the LBJ Ranch until the end of the driving tour. And now there is talk that they're going to reverse that, but in the meantime, currently as it stands today, it's the last thing that you get to. So you will visit a number of buildings before you even get there. And so that map is super helpful to sort of, you can't get lost because there's only one road and they drive you through, but you know what you're seeing. So for starters, the very first thing you come to is the Junction School. And that is where LBJ started his education career at 4 years old, and is where he signed one of his important legislation pieces. And I can't remember the exact name of it, but it was like the early education bill of some kind. And he went back to that very first school that he ever went to sign that legislation when he was president. So it's got a place in history all of its own.
After Junction School, you're going to continue down the road and you will find the Johnson Family Cemetery, where the president, the first lady, parents, grandparents, quite a few of the Johnson family are buried in that cemetery. Some with more prominent headstones than others, we noticed, but there's a lot of family members there. And then there are still a number of different buildings from sort of the Johnson family history that are here.
Well, LBJ was actually born on that property. The house that he was born in had been razed at some point. His family didn't need it any longer and they took it down. But when he, rebought the property and moved over there, he had that building reconstructed. So today it still stands, and he used it throughout his presidency as a guest house. So it does look pretty much like it did when he was born there. But over the years, they had turned it more into a guest house style with accommodations. But that building is still standing there. And so it's still old in a sense. And then his original grandparents' house, which is just next door, is still there. And so you can't go into those. Most of the rooms are closed off. You can kind of peek in the windows of them and see. But that's just kind of cool because that's where he spent a lot of his time growing up. Even after the family had moved into Johnson City, LBJ would come back out here and visit his grandparents. And so that house is still there as well. And there are other houses on the property, but they are now used by the National Park Service as like caretaker and superintendent type houses. So the houses are there, you just can't visit them any longer because they're still in use today as, current facilities.
Next, as you start to drive through the ranch, you're literally driving through the ranch. So you're seeing the open pastures, you're seeing cattle from LBJ's herds, you're seeing the show barn, and you're eventually going to end up at the visitor center, which is where the old hangar was and the runway that they had constructed.
I guess we should probably note that the cattle are like new cattle. It's not the same cattle that LBJ had. It's descendants of his herd, but it was a prize-winning herd, so it is kind of important.
Yeah, they're not super old cows. They're fresh cows, but they are descended from that original herd that LBJ had.
When you get to the show barn, do get out and take a look around there because there are some cattle that are, sort of kept on display that aren't out in the pasture. So you can, take a look at them. There's usually some little goats running around, but they also have some displays of, the tools and techniques that a both at the time cattle ranch then and modern cattle ranch today would be using. So make sure you get out and take a look at the show barn. It's also a great place to get a good view of the runway that runs through the middle of the ranch. I mean, it is just kind of very weird to see it, and it's not obviously really in use today, but you kind of get a feel for that because, as you said, when you get to the visitor center, the airplane hangar is there, which is actually now the visitor center. But you also get to see Air Force One half. And it's kind of funny. It's my size airplane. No, it's what LBJ used to get from either San Antonio or Austin in the major airports out to the ranch because they could not land Air Force One here at the ranch. The runway just was not big enough to handle that. So they have a smaller aircraft. I don't remember the exact specifications of that aircraft, but it is painted like, Air Force One. And LBJ always commonly referred to it as Air Force One half. And it is on display now today.
I thought it was interesting. You stop at the show barn and it gives you kind of a glimpse of LBJ, the rancher and the Texan, right? And I think that's why you should stop there and you see that. And then you keep going when you get to the visitor center and the old hangar, that's where you really get into more of the presidential LBJ. And there's a good display, a number of good displays there that kind of get into his life as president and Lady Bird's life and that kind of thing. So there's different things to see there. But what you and I really enjoyed, I think, most was they do use the original hangar, and they kept parts of the original hangar from, the wood paneling, and they show off like the movie or they set it up as a theater from time to time and watch movies, and they have a lot of that stuff still there that you can see.
I think that was really cool. Now, you have to think this was, 50s to 70s, essentially, 1950s, 1970s, and going to the movie was a big deal. You didn't have home theaters. You didn't have, TVs and VCRs. So they literally constructed a home theater in the hangar. And so that was going to be a really big deal. And they invited their friends and family over. And so, yeah, you can still see the projector up behind the wall and the speakers. And they have a little whole timeline. They even have the old jukebox that somebody made for them that was specific, like, here's the music we played while we were waiting for the show to start and their guests were mingling. So I just think that was very clever, but a good use of repurposing the space and not just constructing a new visitor center. There are a number of telephones that you can pick up and listen to the conversations that LBJ recorded because he was very big on always having a telephone near him, but B, recording conversations. And there's just like hours and hours and hours of tape conversations. And so they have some of those on display that you can listen to him, and whether he's talking to Bobby Kennedy or he's talking to a senator or he's talking to a good friend or just, somebody prominent in his life at the time. There's a couple conversations that Lady Bird had with people. So it's fun to hear voices. It's fun we don't necessarily always, know or think about what people sounded like. And so it's just fun to have those memories to listen to. But there's just also a lot of other displays. Some of the displays and the information are very similar to what we saw in Johnson City or, the LBJ Library. But you also get a unique perspective here too. So if this is the only place you visit, you still get that same history.
You mentioned him always wanting to have a telephone nearby, and that's kind of a good segue into the next building that comes after the hangar, and that is the Texas White House. And one of the things they talk about is that he wanted to be able to have a telephone available anywhere, and that included at the pool at the Texas White House. And remember, this is the 1960s, so there's no cell phones, and so the big deal was they had a desk phone essentially with like a 72-foot cord that they could string all the way out to the pool so that he could be on it whenever he needed to be. Apparently, he was very prolific on the phone. He was constantly on the phone. There's one display you talk about, we mentioned the sitting and watching the movies, and apparently he was known for either falling asleep during most of the films or getting up and leaving 3/4 of the way through because he had to make a phone call. So
there is that. But I think what surprised me most about seeing the Texas White House was actually how small it was. I don't know why I had it conjured up in my head that it was this like ginormous like McMansion. And for the time, I'm sure it was, and it still is a large house. But what's unique about it is that it started out as an old 1800s brick building, 2 stories. And then over the years, family members added on to it. So it was his aunt and uncles for a while. And then when he bought it and, as his family outgrew it and his needs and his duties as president outgrew it, they just kept adding on. So it's a little disjointed, but it's really not all that big. And when you say the pool, I mean, the pool's literally like 2 steps out the back door. So it's not like it's like far away and out in the back. It's just more when you think of the technology at the time, how they had to accomplish some of the things they did.
And you do get to wander all around the outside of the Texas White House and take a look at it all. Unfortunately, you cannot go inside the Texas White House right now. It's been closed since 2018. They had some concerns with structural repairs that needed to be done. And while it's technically not unsafe right now, they wanted to make sure that it stayed safe. And so they figured a lot of people going through there was just going to make it deteriorate that much faster. So they shut it down in 2018, put in for grants to try to get some repairs and remodeling done to it. We found out when we were visiting just recently that just this year, just in 2022, the grants finally came through. And so now they have, 3 years worth of work to do on it. So it's going to be a while before you can get inside. But you can take a look at the outside. You can take a look at the grounds. And there's actually a pretty decent virtual tour that you can get to online. You can either look at it while you're at the hangar. They have it at the visitor center there that you can kind of walk through the house, or you can get to it online. And I've done that. It's a pretty neat, it's an interesting look at 60s and 70s decorating from inside the house.
Well, I kind of snuck a sneak peek through one of the windows that was still open, and it was definitely like yellow Formica countertops. I mean, it's very 70s in there. I think it's still a really cool thing to visit because it's such a huge part in history. It's one of the only presidents that's really had a second White House. I mean, that conducted, it's like 30+% of his business in the time that he was in office was done here at the ranch. I mean, that's a large percentage of time. I mean, and so they had to set it up. I mean, there's the Secret Service building is still on the grounds that they use for the communications and all this, security and everything. So I do feel for the security guards and the IT people at the time. And we've read some books, listened to a couple podcasts on what being a Secret Service agent was like. And when they get to LBJ's life, the stories that they have to tell are kind of funny. With so much to see here at the ranch, don't be discouraged because you can't go into the Texas White House because it's still a very cool piece of property and just such a unique time in history. And speaking of that history, one of the unique features that I really liked about it was, I guess, what they call sort of friendship bricks. And instead of having a traditional guest book like most people do, LBJ had his guests sign their names in little cement blocks, and then he used to pave sort of like their outdoor garden area like in front of the house. And those are still there and have some really interesting signatures, everything from, a former President Gerald Ford to some astronauts and other dignitaries. That was his way of sort of keeping the memory of everybody that came to visit and sort of having a little souvenir of his own.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned a souvenir of his own, because another big thing that LBJ was known for was when you came to the ranch, you left with gifts. There's a huge room in the visitor center still where they still have tons of stuff of examples of things that he used to give away. And I don't mean just like one example of each. There's stacks of things.
Yeah, why didn't they give it to us?
There was everything from, lighters and playing cards to cowboy hats and boots and kids' toys and all kinds of things emblazoned with LBJ's insignia and stuff on them. It's really interesting.
There was so much in there. Like I think, ashtrays, razors. Because I read somewhere that he wanted to be the first thing that you thought of when you went to bed and you got up. So it was like a razor and a toothbrush, I think, were like two of the big things that he liked to give away. But there's also like busts of his head and it's just so much. I don't know why they're not giving it away now, but it's all like tucked in this little room now so you can see the boxes and boxes of gifts.
So it's really interesting. The whole thing, the whole experience, the whole LBJ experience, right? From Johnson City in the Boyhood home to going to Austin and seeing the library to coming here to the ranch, checking out the state park that's across the street from it. I mean, there's just so much to do in this little area of Stonewall, Texas. And it's all free. That's the great part about it, right? So the library's not free.
Oh, sorry, the library's not free.
Okay,
everything else is free.
everything but the library is free.
We forgot about the library.
We did pay for the library, but
it's worth it.
It is worth it. We decided it was worth it to pay for that. But the state park, the ranch, the Boyhood home, all of that is free. So get here to Stonewall, go to Johnson City, go to Austin if you make it. Pick out just one of them if you can. But this is a really interesting time in history, and it comes to life when you see it through the eyes of the president of the United States and everything that he and Lady Bird did in this country and for this country. And I just think you really ought to check it out whenever you can. Keep on trekking.
And we'll see you out there.